My guest today is the author of Profiles in Corruption, which has 4,236 reviews on Amazon. He's also the author of Secret Empires, Clinton Cash that nearly cost, it pretty much cost Hillary Clinton the election in 2016 when he came out with that in 2015. He's also got a couple documentaries that came out, a recent one, Riding the Dragon, which is a story of Biden's and Hunter Biden. He's a former William J. Casey Research Fellow at Stanford University, Hoover Institution, similar to Milton Friedman, as well as Thomas Sowell and many other greats. So with that being said, Peter, thank you so much for being a guest on Valuetainment.
Great to be here. I'm really looking forward to it. Thanks.
So Peter, last time you wrote Clinton Cash, some people said that kind of influenced and hurt the election. This time around, you wrote, I believe it's Profiles in Corruption, which was the one that came out this year, January of 2020. And when we look at the numbers, Biden won 76.3 versus Trump 71.6. How come your book and videos couldn't have more influence to turn this thing around? And how come it wasn't as effective as Clinton Cash? I'm just curious, and obviously, your thoughts on the numbers of 76.3 versus Trump 71.6.
Yeah, boy, talk about a little bit of pressure there, huh? Right? No, I think, I think that the people are concerned about corruption. It's not their only concern, but it's a major concern. What I'm most heartened by is the fact that people are concerned about these issues because corruption goes to the heart of our representative government. A corrupt official is not somebody who's representing their constituents. It's somebody that's representing their corrupt interests or representing themselves. So I'm just very glad that the books do get the attention. I'm glad that at least some people in the American public learn about Hunter Biden and the connections that the Biden family has to the Chinese government. I certainly wish it had been more because I feel like a lot of people in the mainstream media didn't want to go there. But what's exciting these days, of course, is that there's all new sources of information like this program, things online. So it's very hard for them to squelch a story like they might have been able to do 5 or 10 years ago.
So I have a lot of different topics I want to cover with you. You know, you're somebody that's every time you write a book, people line up to buy your books. People want to know what you have to say. New York Times bestseller over and over again. They're curious to know how you process issues, your research, all of that combined together. So, Peter, you know, I was born and raised in Iran. So to a family whose mother's side communist, dad's side imperialist. And there was this joke. My mom's family was from Russia, Armenians, Assyrians. There's this joke about if you want to be rich in countries like that, politics is the way to go, because if you get into politics through corruption, you can create some wealth for yourself. How much of that applies to America?
I think it increasingly applies to the United States. There's no question about it. I mean, there have been similar jokes in the United States through our history. In New Jersey, there's an old saying, you know, pass a bill, create a living. In other words, you pass some law, you can create it and juice it in such a way that you can self-enrich. That's an inherent problem with government. But I think what's happened in the United States is you have a couple of phenomena that are happening at the same time. On the one hand, you have a series of places around the country where you basically have one-party rule. California would be an obvious example. Whenever you have, in a sense, one-party rule where there's not really a lot of competition between the parties, that invites inbred corruption. But the second problem is more foundational and fundamental, and that is that government is increasingly involved in so many parts of our lives. It creates more income opportunities. And that's, I think, a mistake that people make, is they got to understand that part of the challenge we face in Washington, D.C. with the size and scope of government is ideological. There are people who actually defy the rules of history, defy the examples of history, and believe that socialism and governments actually work. So they're actually true believers in socialism. But along with that, you have a lot of people in Washington, D.C. who are not necessarily committed ideologically, but they know that as government grows and expands, it creates business opportunities for them. So if you look over the span of American history over the last 70 to 80 years, the fact that the government's become increasingly involved in healthcare, in energy, in transportation, in technology, in all of those areas, that creates a business model opportunity for people in Washington, D.C. and politicians to self-enrich. It allows them to extort money. It allows them to create gateways or barriers to companies that essentially they have to pay politicians to get removed. So it is a problem that has existed in our history, but it's getting worse. It's getting worse because of the lack of this competition in certain areas like California and New York. But at the same time, because the government has expanded its areas of responsibility, it creates a, let's say, target-rich environment for corruption.
You're saying it's getting worse. Wouldn't it be worse 100 years ago with no phone, social media? It's tougher to break the law and kind of make money on the side. You're saying it's getting worse today with more tools of being able to hold people accountable, where people are texting, you're documenting more. Maybe 100 years ago, you couldn't document. How is corruption getting worse today?
Well, I think it's getting worse because of the level of opportunity. I mean, if you were a congressman in 1900, let's say, the scope of what the federal government did was actually fairly limited. This is before you had a Department of Transportation, a Department of Energy, a Department of Education. This was before you had a regulatory regime that applied to so many industries. And the thing people have to understand is that government power creates an opportunity for the benefit of the political class. There's actually a school of economics called public choice theory. Public choice theory really says you have to look at government officials and bureaucrats the same way you look at a businessman. A businessman is trying to build his business for his benefit, for the benefit of profit. That's actually good. That's what fuels our economy. Just because somebody puts on a government hat does not mean that they're not self-interested, they're not interested in their own self-good and their self-profit. So we have to understand that's the model. So yes, you are correct. There's more transparency today in the sense that we have the internet, we have the Freedom of Information Act, we have these tools, but the problem is the field of battle for self-enrichment is so much larger. A congressman today has so many more industries that he can effectively shake down than a congressman in 1900 ever even could have dreamed of.
Can you unpack what shakedown means to you?
Yeah, shakedown basically means extortion. People are used to thinking of extortion in the context of what the mafia does. They visit a local a butcher shop in Buffalo, New York, and they basically say, look, if you want to pay protection money, it'd be terrible if something happened to this shop. Pay protection money and we'll make sure that nothing happens. Well, that's extortion. We all recognize that's illegal. We've seen that in movies. Some people have experienced that. Government oftentimes can function the same way. There are many members of Congress that use tools and techniques that aren't widely discussed. I've written about them. Members of Congress have talked to me about them. They have something called a milker bill. It doesn't have anything to do with the dairy industry. It's designed to milk money from certain industries. So how does a milker bill work? Well, if I'm the chairman of a powerful committee in Congress and I need to raise money, or let's say I need to find a lobbying opportunity for my son, I'm going to introduce a bill in Congress to, let's say, put a 20% surtax on the high-tech industry in Silicon Valley. Now, I don't actually believe in this bill. I don't even necessarily want this bill to pass. But what's going to happen is that when I introduce that bill, I'm going to have a flood of lobbyists from Silicon Valley come and say, Congressman Schweizer, why are you introducing this bill? And what will happen over the next 60 days is a dance whereby they will come and meet. They will hold fundraisers for me. They will write campaign checks to me. They might even hire my son or my nephew as a lobbyist for them. This happens all the time. My question fundamentally is, how is that any different than the shakedown of the shop owner in Buffalo, New York? It's the same form of extortion. It's the same element that says, look, something bad is going to happen to you. I'm going to take more money away unless you pay me protection money now. And that happens in Washington, D.C. all the time. And it's the kind of extortive behavior that's become all too familiar in Washington. I think that there's sort of a myth. A lot of people feel that the problem in Washington is that there's all this money flowing into Washington, that corporations and businesses around the world are just happy to send their money to Washington, D.C. They don't really want to, but they feel like they have to, because if they don't, bad things are going to happen to them. And that's exactly what the political class in Washington wants them to believe, because it's so lucrative for the political class.
So business model, number one, introduce a bill that you have no interest in to scare off whoever it is in any kind of an industry, meat, technology, healthcare, whatever it may be. Then wait for the lobbyists of those companies to reach out to you to say, hey, you know, we don't think this is a good bill. Can we change your mind, et cetera, et cetera. Then what happens? Because is it a way of me paying your campaign, or is it side money? What happens next? Because that's the question.
It's a great question. Oftentimes it's campaign money. Actually, in my book, Extortion, there's an example from a gentleman named Mr. Hoffmeister, who's the CEO of Shell Oil. And he described a meeting that he had in 2009. You remember in 2009, oil prices were pretty high. He sat before a congressional committee. Members of Congress, including Maxine Waters, essentially said, we want to nationalize your company. We think it's outrageous, the profits you're making. Hoffmeister reported to me, and I put in my book, that after that meeting, Congressman Waters talked to him and said, I might understand your issue better if we spend some time together. And this was basically saying, you need to raise money for me, and I will take the threat for nationalizing your business away. So what you're doing is you're having a series of coded conversations, but you know exactly what's going on. A shakedown is taking place. And the beauty or the genius of a milker bill is you don't actually want it to pass. If I introduce a bill for a 20% tax on Silicon Valley and that bill passes, guess what? I can't introduce that bill again and shake down Silicon Valley. I actually want the bill to fail. One of the reasons that you see a lot of tax credits that are passed. For example, in 1981, Congress passed a bill for an R&D tax credit for companies to invest in research and development. People wonder in the business community, why has that tax credit never been made permanent? Well, the reason they ask that question is they're not thinking about this as a shakedown. If they make the tax credit permanent, congressmen can't go back to them and ask them for money when they have to extend it. So they have these things called tax extenders. We're going to extend a tax credit for 2 to 3 years. And then what's going to happen is they're going to have to come, they're going to meet with me, they're going to raise more money with me, and then I'm going to vote to extend it for another couple of years. But I'm never going to make it permanent, because if I make it permanent, I lose my leverage and my ability to extract money from it.
That's powerful, by the way, what you just said right there. So it's an increment. So let me leave it. To renew it, you need to spend money, or else I'm not going to renew it. So you got to help me out. And it's constant. It's never ending.